Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Verdon. I am the Horticulture Small Farms Extension Agent for Johnson County. And welcome back to Dig Your Dinner. It's been a couple of months since we've had one. We're very excited to dig into graceful grapes today with you all today. You know how we like our cheesy titles over here. So, nothing more graceful than a grape. Uh, we are going to go over the growing conditions here, and then Chelsea's going to talk a little bit on the nutrition and some serving options for you. So, delving right in, if I can get my computer to work with me. There we go. I always like to give a recommendation for some publications that you can work with as you are working with grapes, specifically in this instance. The Midwest Home Fruit Production Guide is probably the best publication out there for any kinds of small fruits that you're trying to grow in the home garden. It'll help you specifically with your pest management quite a bit, but also your cultural practices and just sort of avoiding those common issues you may be facing with a lot of different types of fruits. Also, a lot of nearby extension offices have some great publications on fruits. Unfortunately, K-State doesn't necessarily have a lot of fruit publications, but yeah, extension's a network, right? So we all work together. And as long as you search that .edu with the topic you're looking for, extension anywhere will have that reliable research-based information. So the one I'm highlighting here is from the University of Minnesota. The one thing you want to keep in mind when you are using other extension resources is just that specifically with fruits and vegetables that you may be growing, the growing locations are going to vary a bit. So when you're pulling something from Minnesota, the recommendations are going to be great, but the timelines may be off. Specifically there, it's very cold for the majority of the year, right? So they're probably a month later than we would be. So, an overview for what I'm going to talk about here, or just kind of an overview for grapes in general. Grapes are actually a great fruit option for Kansas. This is one of those plants where Kansas has some weird, growing conditions in general. It's very hot here, it's dry, it's windy, but grapes, they can actually do well here. Quite well here, and we're going to talk about that in this next slide. But there's numerous hardy varieties that you can opt to work with. The use of the grape itself does dictate the type of plant that you want to be planting. So you have to keep in mind what are you going to be doing with these grapes. So we'll discuss that. There are very specific pruning practices with grapes to keep them viable and producing for you. So that is probably the most important thing on this slide for you to keep in mind. And we're going to go really dive into pruning when it comes to your grapes. But that is a very essential factor for the production of the fruit itself. And then the fixed maintenance schedule that comes along with that pruning. So, as I mentioned, grapes grow very well in Kansas. Actually, historically, back before Prohibition was a thing, Kansas was actually one of the top three producers of grapes in the entire United States. Instead of traditional row crops around the state, you were seeing vineyards everywhere. With Prohibition, that kind of faded away. But the vineyard scene within Kansas is actually starting to pop back up in many locations. And that is because grapes, they actually thrive in very warm and relatively dry conditions. So they're something that don't need center pivot irrigation. They work very well with these sort of unpredictable climatic conditions that you're going to be facing in Kansas environments. And when I say Kansas, yes, it applies to Western Kansas, but even here in North Central Kansas, or not North Central, East Central Kansas, it is going to apply to us as well. So full sun, 6+ hours a day are just going to be great for it. Well, draining soil, drip irrigation is kind of essential, and we'll talk about that some more. Wind produces air circulation, so the windiness that we have in Kansas actually gets put to good use because grapes are very prone to fungal diseases. So the wind will keep that air circulating, and those spores and the water that helps those spores grow will less be able to establish. And then it does prefer, and this is a bit an antithesis to Kansas conditions, but it does prefer a slightly acidic soil pH for optimal growth. So that is the one thing you do have to keep in mind is that since we have more so alkaline leaning soils around here, you may need to be helping the soil be a little bit more acidic for that optimal growth. So first, I wanted to kind of delve into choosing varieties, right? Because that's the natural first step when you're planting grapes is, well, what kind of grape am I going to plant? There's lots of different uses for grapes. So you're going to have to kind of keep in mind, what am I going to do with these? If you're just going to eat them as a table grape, then there's specific varieties for that. If you're going to make a juice or a jelly, a jam, preserve, there's grapes for those. And then obviously there's wine grapes as well. We're not going to get delve into how to make wine in this program, unfortunately. But there are entities out there that can help you out with that. But just keep in mind that there are grapes that are specifically meant for making wine with, and they're not necessarily good for table grapes or for your juices or jams or jellies. So, looking at a few of the recommended varieties here, there's actually a pretty extensive list from K-State on recommended grapes. And I just highlighted the first three in each of these lists because really there's not one that's better necessarily than the other. It's a matter of preference and it's a matter of use. So kind of highlighting here that with this, beta variety, the American variety, that's for jelly grapes, and the Catawba and Concord, those would be either table grapes or juice grapes or wine grapes, or it could be a jam grape. And then looking at your French American varieties, these are often wine grapes, but there are some tables in there. There's the Aurore, the Baco Noir, and Chancellor. Um, Often those are going to be used towards your wines. But one of the main things you're going to want to keep in mind actually is that aside from your French American varieties, which are a hybrid between the American and French, obviously, the European varieties in general are not going to be hardy in Kansas. So those are the ones you're going to want to avoid. But this publication that's highlighted on the right here, the small entry fruit cultivars, publication from the KSRE bookstore, has all of the recommended varieties that you could want to consider within Kansas. And honestly, it probably hasn't been updated super recently, so there's likely more out there. So definitely do your research and just kind of look at what you're wanting. So when it comes to planting grapes, there's two things to keep in mind. You are likely either going to get a bare root plant or you're going to get a potted vine plant. And there's different ways to handle each of these. But these will be planted in March to April. So as soon as the growing season really starts, that's the time recommended to get those into the ground because you want a very long establishment season for your grapes so they can grow a hardy root system that's going to then generate lots and lots of leaves and just a hardy plant in general that's likely to establish and survive throughout the winter. Now, if you do have a bare root plant, what is recommended is you dig a hole about 3 times the size of the bare roots when they're spread out. Soak those roots for 3 to 4 hours prior to planting so that it doesn't have to, it's not like sticking a dry stick into dry ground, that you already have some moisture within the plant itself to help it establish after you've planted it and then watered it in. With your potted vines, you do also want to plant these ASAP, and you want to minimally disturb those roots because the roots of grapes are pretty sensitive. They are also very high. They grow generally high towards the ground, so you want to be uh, careful with any kind of cultivation methods. But the recommended method here is actually to just take your plants and look at all of those canes growing on the vine you brought or bought, and you want to remove all of them except for the two most vigorous ones. And you want to keep in mind that these two most vigorous ones are what you are then going to train throughout the coming growing season to help establish. These will become your trunk essentially to your vine as this plant becomes a perennial and gets older and older. So they really need to be hardy. They need to make sure that there's no broken stems or any broken pieces on them. Just choose the most vigorous ones that you have. And then you will also want to keep in mind that grapes are big plants, they are heavy plants. Um, they need to be supported. This is going to protect the fruit itself, keeping it off the ground and away from critters, and helping with the harvest of the fruit as well, because you'll have those bunches that are just then hanging down and easily visible. That's also really going to help you with containing the plants, because these vines can grow for 11 plus feet, and they'll get quite bushy, and it'll be difficult to really contain them otherwise. So there's lots of different options out there. There's arbors, fences, and posts. I'd say with the posts, you're kind of limiting yourself as far as how big the plant it can really get. But with your arbors and fences, obviously, great options. The fences are probably going to be the most common, which we'll talk about in this next slide here. But again, vines, they get heavy very quickly, which means that your supports need to be very sturdy. It's not like a, flimsy kind of support that you want to put in place. You want to be using really thick posts, really, and heavy metals. Um, or excuse me, thick metals is what I meant by that, to be supporting these. You also want to account for the windscreen effect. So these leaves will grow very densely. So with the high Kansas winds, you need to remember that if we get a day or a storm coming through where it's 90 miles an hour winds pressing against the screen, there needs to be a very thick, sturdy foundation there so that that screen doesn't topple over with your plant. And then account for the maintenance and harvest schedules. So again, you just remember that you've got to be able to get to these great bunches. So easing your process there is always going to help you out. So this is what a standard support structure looks like for most grapevines. You've got deeply planted posts on both sides. These are going to be thick posts that can withstand winds. You've got strong wire that is then strung up in two different locations at about a 2 to 2.5 foot interval. And this is what you're going to then take your auxiliary vines off of that main vine and string them out on. Um, as far as the spacing between the vines themselves, the general recommendation is 6 to 8 feet between plants. Um, and then again, just make sure you've got strong wire and thick and sturdy posts. So looking at watering real quick, as I mentioned, the roots of your plants are going to be generally right near the top of the ground. So 1 inch or a half an inch of water per week, it will generally suffice. That is around 5 gallons over a 3 by 3 area of the ground. That'll equate to 1 inch of water. Your pot grown grapes are going to need regular watering as opposed to maybe your bare root grapes. And again, that's just because they're used to that consistent moisture, so they're going to be prone to wilting very quickly if they're not no longer getting that out of nowhere. Um, so with grape watering, the best and ideal practice is drip irrigation. This is because you are, again, mitigating the fungal issues that tend to pop up with these plants. The leaves are very dainty and they're prone to getting sick very easily. So that means you need to be trying to keep moisture off them as much as possible. And doing so with a drip system where it doesn't necessarily have to sit on the ground, but just not be on the leaves. That's really going to help you out. So you have a picture here on the right that kind of illustrates this. And what they're doing is they're keeping the drip a little bit off the ground, and that's actually going to help when it comes to like mice and voles and critters in the wintertime that are going to be eating through that line to try to reach water. But it is not going to be applying any of that water itself to the leaves. After trunk establishment happens, uh, you are going to have more drought tolerant after the second season. So the first season, that's really when you're going to want to be aiming to have as ample. I'm sorry, are you still seeing my screen there? Okay, perfect. Um, the second season, that is when you are not going to need as much water pressure or as much water support as the first season. But as with any kind of perennial plants, you're really going to want to be having that extra moisture there on the as the plant begins to establish. Older vines are going to need a little additional are going to need little additional water unless drought conditions persist. So I do have an asterisk on this one just because there is a dry season here in Kansas City. Generally, that's around June time. Right after May showers have happened, we get about a month and a half to 2 months of drought. So if you've got a backyard grape, that is generally the time. It's hot out, there's not a lot of water. You're going to want to be putting a little bit of additional water on those plants, even if it is well established. But generally, after establishment happens and it's been around for several years, it needs less and less support. So when it comes to fertilizing and mulching your grapes, grapevines again are very, very vigorous growers. So with that, they're going to be actively utilizing nutrients very quickly. So adding compost yearly is something that is recommended with this plants. And then as far as the nutrients themselves, we recommend just getting a soil test to kind of gauge where they're at. It's going to depend on the year-to-year conditions of the plants that the plants are growing in as well, as far as how many or how much of the nutrients profile within the soil is actually getting utilized. So the best way to gauge how to amend for best growth is to keep an eye on that yearly. Mulching is actually generally not recommended with your grapes, and that is because they prefer to have warm roots so that they can produce better. And the mulch itself is going to cool the roots off. So instead of mulching, you can try to opt for like a lawn option underneath. This will also cool the roots, but it will not cool as much and it will help with that weed control components because you don't want a ton of weeds growing in there. Ideally, it would probably be bare soil or something less cooling than mulch under there. But bare soil just immediately invites in root or weed pressure. So you kind of have to find a happy medium there. And a lot of your industrial producers, they'll just opt for grass underneath. So here's the important message I was telling you all to keep an eye on, and that is the pruning of grapes is essential for the actual development of the fruit itself. So one of the things I wanted to point out here as well is that after your vine grows for your year, you're going to have a big wiry plant there. And what's actually recommended is that you remove 80% to 90% of that vine every year during pruning. This is okay. This is what is recommended. So you're not killing the plant by taking so much of it away. What you are trying to aim for, though, is to have fruiting spurs and renewal spurs. So all of these little branches off of our auxiliary vine here up top in this image, these are our spurs. And the way you designate spurs is by the number of buds that are present there. So with the fruiting spurs, you're going to leave 3 to 6 buds because these are the ones that are going to develop the fruit this year for you. And then with the auxil or the renewal spurs, these are the ones that are actually just going to be allowed to grow throughout the year, and you're not going to do anything with them for the year. And these ones next year will be your fruiting spurs. So essentially, you are producing this year's fruit, but you're also getting ready to produce next year's fruit. So those are the things to keep in mind as you are pruning and trying to enhance the amount of a crop you're going to get out of this plant. And here's some physical real life examples of this. So this is what a grape would look like on the left before pruning, and then after pruning on the right. It's really a bare plant, right? You've got the spurs there, you've got the main trunk, and you've got it, staked and tied and ready to go for the season, but you're really allowing it to completely rejuvenate and develop that new fruits. If you were to not prune, you're just not going to get nearly as much fruits at all from the plant. So it really is essential if you're aiming for a productive grape season. That said, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, year one pruning is different. So this would be year two and beyond, where you're just aiming for um, you know, development. This is aiming for establishment. So with this, choose your 1 or 2 main canes. As I mentioned, these would be the healthiest, and these are the ones that will eventually develop into your trunk that you then have your auxiliary canes growing off of. You also want to top these, so remove the tops of the canes and encourage that outward growth so that you're getting that fence effect and you're not just getting a vine that's getting longer and longer and longer. I don't know where that slide came from. That's not supposed to be here, but it's actually good that I have it here. This was from my blueberry presentation. And we'll just talk about wildlife control real quick. So birds are going to be a huge factor with your grapes. And one of the things you can consider is a netting option to keep your grapes safe, but you will need some kind of a structure around it. And then also keep in mind that the netting itself is not necessarily going to be the most safe for birds if you're not doing it correctly. So you don't want to harm birds, obviously, but it needs to be something that um, has small holes and is easily visible by the birds. So something that is hard for them to get stuck in, and that they can easily avoid is going to be the best option for you. But yes, that's very fortuitous that it was actually here because it definitely applies to grapes as well. So when looking at harvesting grapes, you can actually tell, the best way to usually tell the ripeness is by the color change that's going to happen with it, and then generally just by taste. Sour grapes, that is your indication that it is unripe yet. But usually August, September, is the time when grapes are going to be harvested. So right now, and that as well is also going to be dictated by the variety. So some may fluctuate as far as your harvesting time. You want to aim for harvesting full clusters when you are getting grapes off the vine. So as this image on the right is showing you, it's not individual grapes you're picking off, it's the entire cluster. And then you want to cool these immediately because these are no longer applied to the plants. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, grapes are very moisture sensitive. So this is part of the plant that is also moisture sensitive. You want to get it to an area where it's just less prone to losing moisture. So storage in general is to refrigerate in plastic to prevent that moisture loss. And then these harvested from the garden will generally last in a refrigerated condition for around 2 weeks. One of the things you should also keep in mind is that winter injury can be pretty common with grapes if it gets too cold outside. So in very harsh winter years where we're getting into the sub-zero temperatures, probably around -12 or something along those lines, you may see a significant die-off in your plants. If this is something that has been observed in the winter, when springtime comes around, you may want to hold off on pruning just to gauge what portion of the plant is still alive. So, limit your pruning afterwards and just kind of see what's popping up and what's still there. If not a lot is popping up, you may need to restart the vine from newly emerging canes, and that's is definitely an option as well. You just need to treat it as though it's year one and you're starting all over again. So don't expect necessarily production that year, but if the plant's still alive, which it likely will be because they do have extensive root systems, you can start again. So just a few common issues with grapes. As I mentioned, there are tons and tons of fungal issues, which I have not highlighted in this presentation because the general recommendation for that is it's going to vary by the disease, but there are fungicides out there that can help you. Japanese beetles are a massive pest of grapes, and the thing is, grapes are actually used as a trap crop because they are so preferred by Japanese beetles, meaning that they will go to that before they go to anything else in your garden. So there are, in this instance where you're intentionally trying to grow grapes for the harvest, you're going to want to be monitoring very heavily for Japanese beetles and trying to keep them out of there as best as possible. Really, if you're going with an organic approach here, just hand picking them off and throwing them into soapy water is going to be a solution, but you're going to really have to be doing that daily and diligently. Hormone traps are a thing, but I would put a strong caution mark on this one that you're drawing every Japanese beetle in the neighborhood to that hormone trap. So unless you have really big property, it's not necessarily the best solution. The way hormone traps work is that they draw in such a big population and catch such a big population that the breeding is reduced for years to come. But the immediate time in front of you, the population is still there. Spotted wing Drosophila, this little fly here on the right, these are flies that actually lay their eggs in blueberries and grapes that are ripe. So these are things to keep an eye on just as grape harvest time is around. Spinosad is an organic option that may be necessary for treatment of them because they will wilt and kind of get a depression and rotting area in them with those eggs. Birds and wildlife, as I mentioned in that one wild slide that came out of nowhere. And then 2,4-D drift is also a big issue with your grapes. So if you're seeing really kind of weird striping and deformities in your leaves of your grapes themselves, that's likely herbicide damage from 2,4-D specifically. The way 2,4-D drift happens is that it's just such a light herbicide that it's volatilizes very easily. So if it's applied to weeds, specifically broadleaf weeds, in an area when it is too hot outside, so usually above 85 degrees, or it's too windy outside, which is usually about 10 miles an hour. Um, it can drift very easily and get onto plants. And then you see these kinds of deformities. Grapes are very, very susceptible to this. So if you yourself are treating weeds within your yard, you need to be very cognizant of this. You might consider covering your plant with a sheet or something as you're even treating weeds in your yard, or go for the more organic treatment options with those weeds. Also, I'd recommend collaborating with your neighbors, just letting them know, like, hey, I've got this plant that's super sensitive. If you're going to spray, let me know, please, and we'll work together on this. That is probably going to be the best solution to avoiding that kind of an issue. And then something fun before I switch over to Chelsea here. Did you know grapes were highly valued in ancient Rome, and were actually given as gifts to demonstrate their wealth? So the wealthy, they almost use this as a form of a luxury item. Imported grapes in the winter actually were seen as the height of luxury, and were reserved for the richest citizens. So for thousands of years, grapes have been grown, and they've been a part of our society. So with that, I'll open it up to questions real quick, and then I will stop sharing my slides here so Chelsea can get ready. Okay, well, if there's no questions for now, feel free to throw them into the chat, and Chelsea, I'll give it to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Get my screen set up here. Yep. All right. So as Anthony said, I'm Chelsea. I'm the Nutrition, Food Safety, Health Agent here in the Johnson County Extension Office. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the nutrition of grapes and give you some ideas for some recipes and how to use them if you are growing them. So grapes have been around for centuries, as Anthony had indicated, many, many centuries. And our dietary consumption of grapes is about 6 million tons per year in the US alone. And so if we think about wine consumption and other grape consumption throughout the global kind of economy, it's a big market. It has been relatively stable over the years, and we consume about 8.3 pounds per capita consumption here in the US. And that was from about 2023, 2024. So you can see this graph here goes all the way back from 2000, 2001. And it's relatively been between that 7.4 to all the way up to 8.6 pounds per capita consumption. So high compared to some other of our fruits. So why should we eat grapes? Grapes, as always, I talk about this every time we talk about a fruit and vegetable, but they really are powerhouses. So 1 cup of grapes is about 22 grapes, and that's probably about a normal size. You know, you have some extra large grapes and you have some kind of smaller ones. So about 22 normal size grapes. That is going to be about 110 calories, 32 grams of carbohydrates. We know that grapes are low protein food. They're not one of our foods that we get a lot of protein from, and they're not relatively a high fiber food compared to a lot of our other fruits that are out there when we think about pears and apples and things like that. There are 25 grams of sugar. This is the natural sugars that are found in our grapes. There's no added sugar. And then, like most of our other fruits and veggies, they are relatively high in water. So about 80% of our fruit, of our grapes, are considered to be of water. They are also high in other nutrients like copper, vitamin K, vitamin C, and potassium. So you can see there. When we think about vitamin C, yes, there is vitamin C in grapes, but it's not as high as what our oranges or some of our other fruits might be. So that's why you don't see an actual percentage listed there. When we talk about water as well, we do know that we want to get 20% of our daily intake of fluids from the foods that we eat. So our fruits and our vegetables are generally going to be those higher water foods. Compared to a sweet potato or a regular potato, we know that those are a lower water content. So we definitely want to eat our fruits and our veggies that are higher in our water, have our soups and our other high kind of fluid foods. The other 80% of our daily intake of our fluid needs should be consumed from our beverages, specifically water, or unsweetened drinks. Skipped ahead there. So another reason why we should eat grapes is really the antioxidants. So grapes are an antioxidant rich fruit, especially when we think about the purple, the blues. Those are going to be our richest fruits that are going to have those rich antioxidants. The most common one that we think of when we think about grapes is resveratrol. And so this is what we typically think of and hear about our wines and a lot of our purple fruits. So this is found in the grape skin specifically. That is where it is most prevalent. And so when we talk about resveratrol, and wine, the winemaking process is really the skins that are kind of that the fermentation and all that stuff. So the skin is the most common source of where we get that resveratrol from. So eating grapes versus having a jam or grape jelly is going to give us more resveratrol because we're consuming that skin to go with it. And as I mentioned, it is only the red and purple. Green grapes do not have the same resveratrol. We can think of that red and purple color as where that resveratrol comes from. It is linked to heart health and reduction of inflammation. So that's why we always promote eating our red and purple foods. You might have heard about drinking red wine for heart health. That's because of that resveratrol. Then we also have some other flavonoids and polyphenols. These contribute to color, taste, and antioxidant activity, and there's several different ones that I'm not going to list out, but that's kind of the general catch-all bucket that they fall in. And then there's quercetin, and that may help support our healthy blood pressure as well. As I mentioned, the antioxidants are generally found in the skin. However, the concentration can change based on the variety, maturity, how it was stored post-harvest, and even environmental factors from how it was grown, if the plant was stressed, all those different things. So here's just a list of several of the researched health benefits of grapes. We have everything from supporting our immune system to reducing our risk of cancer, lowering blood pressure, protecting against cardiovascular disease, reducing cholesterol, reducing your risk of diabetes, supporting brain health, and even supporting good sleep. And so all of these health benefits really do stem from those antioxidants that we find in grapes. Antioxidants are linked to all of these, from reducing risk of cancer because it reduces inflammation, supporting your healthy immune system, reducing risk of diabetes. Even though there is 25 grams of sugar, it relatively is a lower sugar food, supporting brain health. We know that blueberries are super rich in antioxidants that support brain health. And so we think about those deep blue grapes as well. That's going to be kind of along those same lines as our blueberries. And then support good sleep. So grapes actually have melatonin in the skin. Now, there's still undecided research if eating grapes before bed will help you sleep. Really, the quantity isn't probably what we actually need, but it is a fun fact and something interesting that if you are trying to have better sleep, you could potentially start to incorporate some grapes into your daily diet because it might help support some of that good sleep by providing you a little bit of that melatonin through the grapes. And then the flavor profiles of grapes. So we know that our green grapes typically are those more crisp, tart grapes. However, there are some varieties of green grapes that are actually on that sweeter side. I think of one specific one that you'll find common in grocery stores. It's called cotton candy. And so it is going to be more of that kind of sweeter profile compared to our traditional green grapes that we think about that are definitely that more tart and crisp taste. Then we move on to our kind of red, lighter purple grapes, and those are going to be our more juicy, sweet, and they're going to taste more berry-like in their notes than our more green, tart ones. And then moving into that dark black and dark purple. And those are going to be bold and sweet. And some of these actually might be more slightly earthy. They're definitely not going to be as sweet and kind of berry-like as our red ones. If you've ever had the darker purple grapes, you know that they do taste a little bit more earthy, just not the same level of sweetness as what our reds do. And then we have our Concord grapes, which this is kind of rich and tangy in flavor. And as Anthony said, this is our most common grape that is going to be used for your standard juices and jellies that you might find on your store shelves. And then there's the wine grapes, and these are going to be more complex in flavors. And these grapes are higher in tannins, which tannins are what we find in our wines. And so that's going to be a different flavor profile and almost like a dryness or a tartness that might be a result of those tannins compared to some of our other grapes. So keeping that in mind, understanding what the dishes that you're going to be using or how you like. Personally, I don't like green grapes unless they're kind of mixed in with other fruit to counter that tartness. But understanding what your taste preferences are, as well as what you're going to be using it for, is going to help you identify what types of grapes you might be growing in your own yards or that you might be purchasing from the farmer's market or from a store. So there's a lot of different ways to consume grapes. I would say the most common way that we think of consuming grapes is fresh, kind of as a snack or in a fruit salad, or as a juice, or as a jam. When I think of grapes, those are the common ways that I think of. However, there are a lot of different ways to consume them, actually. Grapes are a great addition to like charcuterie boards and just even plating to make it look more pretty if you're making a certain dish, in addition to kind of our traditional snacks and fruit salad. Personally, I love frozen grapes, especially in the summertime when it's nice and hot. I just kind of pop my grapes off the vine and throw them in a freezer. And they can be quite hard right away when you take them out of the freezer, but if you let them set for a few minutes, they kind of soften a little bit, and it's like a little frozen popsicle treat, if you will, instead of our higher sugar popsicles. So frozen's a great alternative for a summer treat. Juice and smoothies. We have our traditional juice, but you wouldn't think to add them in smoothies, but grapes can be added to smoothies. They're not something that you commonly found, but they would be a great addition to smoothies and to blend it up in with a mixture of different fruits or even just as a grape smoothie by itself. And then we have our dried. Dried is pretty common. Raisins, we have currants and sultanas as well, which I never really, until probably even a few years ago, never really understood that currants and sultanas were actually just different forms of dried grapes. So they're basically a raisin, but just come from a different variety of a grape. So the sultanas are obviously the lighter color, and so those are going to be more of your green grapes compared to your traditional black or purple or red grapes. Our grapes are, or excuse me, our raisins are pretty much one dried fruit. There might be a few others, depending on the brand and what type, but generally dried fruit is going to have a lot of added sugar because of the preservation that has to happen and just to make it sweet. Where our raisins are one of the few dried fruits that actually do not have added sugar. So if you're trying to watch how much added sugar you're consuming in the day to day, choosing raisins as your dried fruit option is going to be a good choice. Raisins can be used in baked goods, trail mixes, cereals, oatmeals, and even just as a snack with some almonds or something like that. Jams and jellies, so they can be made with different types of pectins, from liquid to dry pectins. They can be made with different types of sugar. Recently, I made a different jam that had honey in it instead of the traditional one. And so you definitely, when you're making jams and jellies, need to find the recipe and stick with the recipe, but there are some unique recipes out there these days. And they even have some no or low sugar added jams if you are watching your added sugar intake. The fun fact about jams and jellies is that sometimes people don't know what is the difference. Well, a jelly is made with the juice, while the jam is made with the fruit. So, like for a grape jelly, it is going to have that grape juice is going to be the core of that kind of foundation that you add your pectin to, where the jam will be kind of like a cooked grape that will have some grape particles and chunks still in it. So it'll be a little bit of that thicker consistency. And then there's sauces, which, you never really think to put grapes with it, but you could try like a grape barbecue sauce or a grape balsamic reduction as a different twist and alternative to different things. Adding grapes to different salads, as you can see in that kind of bottom right picture with tomatoes and pecans and cheese and all the different good stuff that goes in a traditional salad. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about consuming grapes fermented, which we also know as wine. So, red wine, if you are consuming wine, is recommended over the white wine due to its potential health benefits. Like we had talked about, that resveratrol is going to be the highest in red wine and is not going to be common in your white wines. Our current recommendations for alcohol consumption, though, is it's do not start drinking just to prevent heart disease. So we know that red wine has been associated with reduction in potential heart complications and heart disease. However, if you currently don't drink, we don't want you to start drinking red wine just to receive those heart health benefits. No more than one drink per day is recommended for women and two drinks per day for men. This is according to our current dietary guidelines, which will be reviewed and are currently being reviewed and will be updated here shortly. And what that means is that is a 5-ounce glass of wine is considered one drink. Specifically, I'm just including the wine listing here since this is what we're talking about with grapes. So that would be considered one drink. The Mediterranean diet suggests moderate intake of red wine with a meal, which traditionally, again, that moderate is just the one drink per day. So the key here is when we think about wine consumption and as it's related to a specific diet, like the Mediterranean diet, it is intake with a meal. It is not just having a glass of wine by itself. It's really building it as a part of your meal, which you have your proteins, your fats, your other vitamins and minerals from the food that you're consuming that gives it that added heart health benefit. So the Mediterranean diet is not saying to just drink red wine any time of day and you'll still receive those same heart healthy benefits. You really do need to consume it with the meal, have those healthy fats, have those healthy proteins and everything else with it. So it is all encompassing and not just saying that red wine specifically is what is going to reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease or heart disease. But on the flip side, within the last couple months, new research has come out that suggests even moderate drinking of the one drink per day for women and two drinks per day per men can lead to cancer and other chronic diseases. So I foresee that kind of the dietary guidelines will be revising and reviewing what we consider to be moderate consumption, and that one drink a day or two drinks a day for men might be eliminated. So again, the new research is showing that even moderate amounts of one glass of wine a day or two for men might actually not prevent cancer or other chronic diseases, but could actually contribute to them. So preserving grapes. Personally, I would have never thought to preserve grapes, but when I was doing this presentation and looking through all my canning books and going to my canning resources, you can water bath our green seedless grapes. That is what is recommended by the National Home Food Preservation is to use the green seedless grapes, and they actually recommend harvesting them about 2 weeks before they reach optimal eating quality. The processing time, we can do them in pints or quarts, and we could hot pack them or raw pack them. And if you recall from previous sessions, a hot pack basically is just that you're kind of pre-cooking those grapes, if you will, that prevents shrinkage from happening. It allows some of that water to automatically be released from those grapes before it goes in the canner. And then a raw pack is putting in those cold grapes and then basically putting in a hot liquid on top of them. You do need about 14 pounds of grapes to get 7 quarts or 9 pounds of grapes to get 9 pints. And as I mentioned, the hot pack method, basically you're going to blanch your grapes in boiling water, and then you're going to take that blanched grapes and fill your jars with a hot syrup or a hot liquid. And you do want to leave 1 inch of headspace for our grapes. You can also do grape juice. And so grape juice, you can water bath, and processing times for our grape juice is only 5 minutes for pints or quarts. And fun fact, grape juice and apple juice are the only time that half gallons are ever listed anywhere in any food preservations. If you find a half gallon listed somewhere for not, and it's not grape or apple juice, then it is a not trusted method and you should not follow that method. Personally, I don't have a container big enough to process a half gallon jar, and I think it would be quite heavy if you have that on your stovetop, but they do have the guidelines for if you are doing a half gallon container. You do obviously need a lot more grapes if you're doing juice. So about 25 pounds per 7 quarts or 16 pounds per pints. And then the process is just going to be that you're going to wash and stem the grapes, and then you're going to kind of crush them and bring them to a boil. You're going to simmer them until they're nice and soft, and then you're going to strain them through a jelly bag or kind of a cheesecloth. You're going to refrigerate the juice, and then without mixing, you're actually going to clear off the liquid and discard the sediment. So any of that unwanted stuff that you don't want in your juice is going to settle to the bottom, and then you can just kind of toss that. You could also use a paper cloth coffee filter to make it even a clearer juice. And then there is no recommendations for how much sugar to add. It basically just says sweeten to taste. So you can kind of use your judgment on what type of sweetness you want for that. And then you are just going to process them and let them continue. And then there are lots of grape jams, jellies, and spreads. So on the National Center for Home Food Preservation, these were the two, four, six, seven different jams and jellies and spreads that I found. So we have a grape jam without pectin. We have a grape jelly with liquid pectin. We have a grape jelly with powdered pectin. We have a grape plum jelly with powdered pectin. We have grape conserves, which a conserve is basically just a variety of fruits that typically has some dried fruit mixed in, as well as maybe some nuts or something like that. So this grape conserve, I think, had orange and a few other fruits mixed in with it. And then there's a reduced sugar refrigerated grape spread and a refrigerated grape jelly with a liquid sweetener. So those are all the different just jams and jellies that you can make with grapes, depending on how much you have, what other things you want, what your taste preference is, and everything like that. And then obviously we know that raisins come from our dehydrated grapes. You can certainly make your own grapes at home. Personally, I've never dehydrated grapes, so I can't speak along the process and how it actually works. But you'll just wash and dry, and you do want to soften those skins. I have seen some places where they'll say poke a hole in your grape to allow some of that steam and stuff to escape, but I don't know. I can't verify that. However, the National Center for Home Food Preservation does recommend just boiling your grapes to soften those skins, and then you're going to plunge them in an ice bath to stop the cooking, and then you're going to dry. These do probably take some of the longest for drying. If we think grapes are 80% water and you generally have a large grape that you're trying to dehydrate into this small little raisin, and so they could take up to 20 hours to dehydrate at a temperature of 135. Like always, you just kind of have to keep an eye on them and determine what is going to be your drying time based on the equipment that you have. And then we have freezing. With freezing, our traditional, I personally just always flash freeze them in a single layer on a cookie sheet and then transfer them to a freezer safe Ziploc bag or another container. But you certainly could puree the grapes and freeze them as frozen puree. You could add a little bit of sugar to it, and then you could use that as juice or for smoothies. You could also freeze them in a kind of liquid sugar percentage, like a cold pack, if you will, where you'll put your grapes in a container and then cover them with like a cold sugar syrup, and then you can just freeze them that way. Personally, I think that is kind of sometimes a waste. It's not going to change the quality or texture as much by just freezing them whole in a single sheet. And then you can also do juice for your beverages. You can select those whole grapes, and then you're going to crush them and add some water and simmer them, and then just kind of strain it like you would making your juice if you're canning it. But if you don't want to can the juice, you could certainly just freeze the juice. And then last, we have our recipes. And personally, when I was doing this presentation, I've never used grapes for anything but snacks, right? I maybe added it in a fruit salad, or I've added some grapes to a leafy green salad that I was making, but I've never really used grapes for anything else. And honestly, it's kind of shame on myself because I think there's so many great potentials. As I was looking for different recipes and things, we have this no knead focaccia bread with grapes, pancetta, and rosemary. And so the process is listed there, but basically it's you make a focaccia bread if you've ever made one before, and then you're going to just top it with your seedless red grapes and onions and your pancetta and then some rosemary. And then that's going to be kind of the topping for your no knead focaccia. And then you just bake it, and then those grapes are going to soften in that baking process. And then this is a very Mediterranean based diet based recipe. So we have a marinade where we're going to use some lemon juice and vinegar, some oil, a little bit of white grape juice, some different seasoning and spices, and you're going to kind of marinate your chicken. And then basically after you marinate your chicken, you're just going to cook it. And then you're going to top it with grapes and just kind of heat those grapes just until they're softened a little bit, and then you'll just serve it. So it's kind of just a marinated chicken and grape recipe. And then we have this recipe in our database, and I think we've used this recipe for just some like appetizer events at various locations. And so it's basically you take grapes and they're stuffed with like a cream cheese mixture in the middle. So it's a cream cheese, gram masala, some golden raisins, some crystallized ginger, and some dried apricots. That's kind of all those fruits and stuff are mixed into this cream cheese mixture. And then you are going to slice your grapes and you're just going to put a tiny little bit of mixture, either with a spoon or you can pipe it onto the cut side of the grape. You're going to top with the other grape, making a little sandwich. And then if you're serving them for appetizers or whatever, you can just put a little skewer through them or a toothpick to keep the grapes from falling open. And then you just, the people that you have at your party or event or whatever, you can just kind of take the grape off the skewer and eat it whole as is. And then the last one is one that I'm actually going to try probably in the near future, but it's a crostini with a whipped ricotta and roasted grapes. Again, I would have never thought to roast grapes, but like all of our other fruits and vegetables that we talk about roasting, basically you're going to take some of the red grapes and you're going to roast them with a olive oil balsamic mixture with a little bit of salt, and you roast them on a baking sheet for about 15 to 20 minutes, stirring them halfway through until they're kind of soft and caramelized, but still intact. So you don't want to overcook them where they become too mushy and fall apart. And then you have your crostini bread of whatever your choice is, and you can kind of toast that in the oven to get it nice and brown on both sides, or you could just heat it and not worry about toasting it. And then you have your whipped ricotta. And to whip ricotta, you really just put it in a food processor and blend it until it's super smooth and creamy, which can take anywhere from about 2 to 3 minutes, depending on your blender. So you're just going to kind of pipe or spread some of that whipped ricotta on your crostini bread and then top it with our roasted grapes and then kind of garnish with some of our honey and our fresh thyme sprigs and things like that. And so that is the end of our presentation covering my portion of the food and the recipes. So as always, here's my contact information, and you can get more recipes and get more health information from our In Good Health newsletter that goes out monthly via email. And with that, I'll stop my share and see if there's any questions. Or if anybody has any recipes that they've made with grapes before. Pam, have you cooked with grapes before? I'm going to call her out on that. Awesome. Thanks, Glenda.
Is it okay for me to talk?
Yes, please do.
Okay, so this is Pam, and I do a lot with grapes, which is why I was interested in this. I've roasted grapes and used them as an appetizer with a little ricotta on like a crostini. But one of my favorite things to do with grapes, this is going to sound really odd, uh, is what I call white gazpacho. So you take green grapes and mix it with some balsamic vinegar, some oil, some dill. Um, I don't have the recipe in front of me, but and you serve it chilled, uh, and it's excellent. So yes, I use grapes a lot.
That all sound delicious.
Yeah. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I did want to give a quick plug that next month's Dig Your Dinner is going to be on fennel and kohlrabi. So we're going with a little more unusual produce next month, but definitely some interesting tidbits to pull from that as well. So you'll see the registration information for that posted soon across our social medias, but it should be listed already on our events page on our website, which if you just search Joko KSRE, it will show up. So thank you all so much for your time today, and we'll see you again soon.